I swear I'm not a bandwagoner when I say this, but man, South Carolina is a lot of fun to watch for a number of reasons. I did a deep dive on them, earlier in the summer. I did an episode on them a couple months back, and now it's been a really fun ride to really watch this team progress, watch this team develop, and even just seeing how much success they've had, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Last year at South Carolina, they had one of the worst defenses in the SEC. So for them to really have this huge transformation, particularly on the defensive line, between having Kennard and Kennard and also Dylan Stewart too. Both of them are dogs. Both of them are explosive. Both of them are exciting to watch. And I'm just telling you right now, Gamecock Nation, you're gonna have to pony up some money for those two dudes if you want to make sure they're on the team next year. But one hell of a game last week versus Texas A&M. I mean, you know, what they just did a phenomenal job all around. I mean, they pretty much had their way versus Texas A&M, who's one of the best defensive teams in the entire country. LaNorris Sellers, who I've ranted about on and on and on. As even when I talked about them, last week when I talked about them in North Carolina too, because you don't realize how big LaNorris Sellers is until they do the close up on him. But dude, 240 pounds, he moves like he's 200. He's quick, he's explosive, and he's super hard to get down too. And when you have him and Rocket Sanders together, just a really fun combo to watch all year round. And going into this game versus Vanderbilt too, I it's definitely a game that's circled on my calendar for this weekend for a number of reasons. I mean, when I look and view this game, one of the things that I see in LaNorris Sellers, I kind of see that same thing in Diego Pavia, right? They both bring this sort of energy, that unpredictability of it. They can turn something into nothing. They know how to extend plays, and and quite frankly, they're just a ton of fun to watch, right? I mean, you know, because the thing is too, even Vandy, they have a respectable defense too. And when you look at both these games, the primary question I keep asking myself is who's going to be better at containing the edge, right? Because I mean, the fun of it with Diego Pavia, he's had Auburn's number even his days in New Mexico State. He even when I watched his first game versus Virginia Tech earlier in the year, and for them to you know have that game, and he's just a dog, right? And then they beat Alabama, and it's just such a fun coming, almost I guess I call it a coming of age story in a sense, right? I mean, he came with Jerry Kill, who was his head coach, and then they went to Vandy together. And Clark Leah was kind of like, hey, Coach Gill, we need you here. And they just happened to bring Diego along, and for him to go from New Mexico State, who in many ways has kind of been an irrelevant program, until Jerry Kill kind of came along. And for both those dudes to still have success the way that they're having them, I mean, that's just one of those stories where I think that's one of those things where you just say to yourself, man, that's one of the reasons I love college football is seeing those underdogs have those moments, have those stories, and it kind of progress throughout the year too. But you know, if you're looking at it from a South Carolina perspective, yes, they did a great. They definitely have seen some improvements in the passing game, particularly versus Texas A&M. Career, season high 244 yards passing. All of that's great. All of that's kosher. But when you really think about the South Carolina team, and I say this over and over again, the strength of the team is running the ball and getting those zone reads, those option runs, right? Because the biggest struggle that I've seen from this South Carolina team, at least offensively speaking, is clearly the offensive line. The offensive line has given up too many sacks. You're not getting enough time for those bigger plays to develop, particularly in the play action game, which is one thing I think they could experiment with if they were to kind of able to give Sellers enough time to really be able to pass the ball. And do all those things. So it kind of makes me think to myself, you know, especially when you look at this Vandy team, and you know, a fun stat that I found was Vandy is 0-3 when teams have ran for 34 or more times against them this season. Now, granted, 34 carries is kind of a lot of carries in one game, but South Carolina's yet to do that this year. I've not seen a game this year where they just went in and said and their game plan was, in essence, okay, we're just gonna run the ball, we're gonna pound it down your throat, and we're gonna beat you in the trenches. I think that's the game I'm looking for from a South Carolina perspective, because you're coming off all that momentum. You have every excuse in the world, right? And the thing is too, they have a relatively manageable schedule after this too. I mean, they have Mizzou, they have Wofford, and they have Clemson. These are all winnable games, right? I mean, we could definitely be talking about a possible 8-4, 9-3 South Carolina team. And all not to be a hater or anything, but I'm be the first one to tell you I was not expecting. I'm thinking to myself, okay, if South Carolina makes it 6-6, 7-5 this year with the type of schedule that they've had, hey, I think that would be definitely a step in the right direction too. And when I listened to Shane Beamer's press conference before recording this, and man, he's just so much fun to watch. And seeing the parallels between him and his dad Frank, it's just, man, it's one of those things. I genuinely believe he's going to be one of those coaches that we're talking about, 3 to 5 years from now, in terms of moving up the ranks of college football. And even too, when you think of South Carolina, I mean, we can go back and I don't want to stir the pot too much, but you think of Will Muschamp and how that sort of run came, and then a little bit before that, you had kind of the twilight of Steve Spurrier's career, finishing that at South Carolina. And it goes to show too, is South Carolina the easiest place to win? Not necessarily, but it's not like it's not like you can't get anybody there, right? I mean, there are some solid talents, in the Carolina region. Granted, you're going to have to cherry pick a little bit from northern Florida. You might have to move down south a little bit. But geographically speaking, I mean, at the end of the day, the SEC conference is obviously such a huge sell. The crowd there is electric, and when you're building something like you are there now, there's just so many different reasons to be excited, right? I mean, they're 5-3 this season. They're on a 2-game win streak, 3-3 on the conference, and when you look at it, I mean, 24 Vandy, which I think is a pretty winnable game, assuming that they can run the ball like they think they can versus Vandy. Then you have a Mizzou team who's kind of been up and down. They're not lighting the world on fire like we kind of thought at the beginning of the season, right? I mean, Brady Cook is, when he had Cody Schrader last year, it definitely brought another element to that offense. Whereas it's nothing wrong with Luther Burden and the receiving core that they have there. It's just, you can definitely tell that I think the injuries that Brady Cook has sustained this year, I think, is throwing off his footwork and his rhythm a little bit. But at the same time, they could be coming together too. And maybe they could be poised for an upset too, because South Carolina does have three out of 4 of these games at home too, and then you have your tune-up game versus Wofford before your inevitable bowl game, and then also you finish off the year obviously at Clemson too, which I think will also be another fun matchup, especially considering yourself, you have that history with Dabo. He's won a couple national titles, and you're also thinking to yourself too, like, this could be sort of the pinnacle in terms of kind of asking yourself from a South Carolina perspective, okay, when is Dabo going to kind of turn the page and start using the transfer portal, or can he just kind of double down and say, you know what, I do legitimately believe I can build everything as I'm going to now. But that's another story, that's another situation too. But overall, when I think of the South Carolina team, I'm gonna go on record on this, and I'll probably talk about it in the off season too. but this is a team that I'm certain is going to be, making some attention to. They're going to make some noise. They're going to keep turning heads, and as they continue to ramp up the recruiting efforts, I'd like to see him maybe get a couple more receivers in there, really kind of clean up this offensive line, continue to build up in the secondary a little bit more. The linebacking core, obviously, I think one of the big things that you have going for you as well is they're 11th in tackles for loss. They're fourth in the country, in the nation, with sacks, with 31 sacks on the season. So they know how to get to the quarterback. They're creative in terms of their defensive schemes, and quite frankly too, you can tell that this is a team that is really kind of coming together in in all different facets too. And I think the one thing I keep asking myself is, can they finally build this momentum to the point where it's in a sustainable way, whereas you're not having these heartbreaking losses, you're not having you know these sort of dumpster fires, because 1 week you're playing LSU to the wire, the next week you're getting your ass whooped facing Ole Miss, and then the week after that you're playing Alabama, and again they should have won. They should have won that game. They should have won that game. And I was sitting at the Philadelphia airport watching that game to a T, and I got to tell you that game is still kind of itched in my mind with the onside kick and all that good stuff too. But as you're kind of unraveling all this, moving forward, I mean, South Carolina is obviously one of the teams that I think is going to be on the rise. It's definitely going to be a team that I'm going to have my eyes on too. And obviously, watching this Vanderbilt game, the thing I'm kind of asking myself is, you know, between Sellers and Pavia, who's going to be able to get off, who's going to be able to contain the edge better, who's not going to turn the ball over, particularly fumbles, which I would argue have at times been issues for both quarterbacks. And then most importantly, which secondary is going to give up less bigger plays. And I also think that, converting on third down and controlling the time of possession is going to be huge in this matchup. So definitely tune into this really underrated SEC matchup that we're heading into this weekend.